The bigger demands, actually brain-based, are pattern recognition. Can I understand what's happening in front of me, and then from that attentional process, make the right decision?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 189th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your own brain, including but not limited to, and perhaps especially, high-pressure, high-stakes situations. We've probably all got some of those to deal with some of the time, and they're, of course, the most important situations in our life. So the question is, how do we keep our brains working at their best when we ourselves need to be at our best? In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with a clinical sports psychologist, Dr. John P. Sullivan, who consults with clients who compete at the highest echelons, people in the NFL, NBA, WNBA, the Olympics, and elite performers within America's special forces. He tells those people what they can do to help keep their brains performing well in the clutch, and today he's going to tell us as well. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you about a surprisingly powerful and large group that is apparently now starting to clamor for the end of the drug war as we have known it for the last 50 years. Of course, clamor doesn't necessarily mean action, but nevertheless pretty interesting. I will tell you all about that in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, but for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So that is the sound of me drinking a glass of water, which is something that I've done more times than I care to think about this week. I am slightly under 11 hours from the end of Water Fast Week 2017, which I've talked about in previous episodes. I and more than 100 other Smart Drug Smarts listeners have become very, very familiar with water over the course of the past week. And perhaps as a result of that, I wanted to share some recent studies on water and our sense of taste in This Week in Neuroscience. Convenient timing on this one. So the commonly held accepted wisdom is that the sense of taste has 5 basic tastes. Those are salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. Umami we're a little bit less familiar with in the West, but bear with me on this one. But a study recently conducted at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena and published just last month in Nature Neuroscience is calling into question whether we should include water itself as a 6th major subdivision in our sense of taste. This is definitely coming down on one side of the centuries-old debate as to whether water has a taste or whether it's just sort of a tasteless vessel for other tastes. Legendary know-it-all Aristotle said water was tasteless in 330 BC, but recent studies in insects and amphibians have shown that they have specific water-sensing nerve cells, and there's evidence that taste receptors and mammalian tongues might have something very similar. One mystery in mammalian water consumption has been how we regulate our own sense of thirst. In previous studies by Dr. Zachary Knight at the University of California at San Francisco, they've shown that there are distinct populations of neurons in the hypothalamus that can trigger thirst and also serve as a signal to when an animal should stop drinking. But the brain itself has to receive information about water from the mouth and tongue, because as you know from your own experience, you're smart enough to stop drinking long before the water could actually make its way into your gut or your bloodstream and tell your brain from some secondary source that your body's been replenished of water. So it's suspected that some sort of information must be going straight from the mouth and or taste buds into the brain. So in this recent study, Dr. Yuki Oka, a neuroscientist at California Institute of Technology, he and his colleagues looked for water-sensing taste receptor cells in a mouse tongue. They used what's called genetic knockouts to change different lines of mice so that different types of their taste receptor cells would be non-functional, and then they gave those mice water just in their mouth, let them flush it around to see which cells responded. Says Oka, the most surprising part of the project was that the well-known acid-sensing sour taste receptor cells fired vigorously when exposed to water. They also gave groups of mice access to either water or a tasteless synthetic silicone oil, which kind of looked like water but presumably didn't taste like it, and the genetic knockout mice who were lacking the sour taste receptor cells took longer to choose water, suggesting that these cells do indeed help to distinguish water from other fluids. Another really interesting thing that they did within this study is they added a light-sensitive protein to these acid-sensing taste receptor cells using genetics, so that rather than just stimulating these taste buds with tastes, they could also stimulate them with light. Then, after training the mice to drink water from a spout, the team replaced the water with an optic fiber that shone blue light on their tongues. And when the mice were thirsty, they would lap with their tongues drinking, quote-unquote drinking, the blue light, just as if they were tasting water. Some of the thirsty mice licked the light spout as many as 2,000 1,000 times over the course of 10 minutes. The poor mice never actually figured out that the light was just an illusion and they were not getting satiated with real water. So as Oka explains, although the acid taste receptor cells can distinguish water from other liquids, they don't apparently play any role in telling the brain when to stop drinking. It's unclear exactly how the mechanism works by which the acid-sensing taste buds do respond to water, but one conjecture at this point is that water washes away saliva, which is a salty, acidic mucus, and that perhaps it's a change in the pH surrounding these cells that makes them more likely to fire. But there's plenty of other options, including temperature, pressure changes, so research continues on this one. Personally, my money is on scientists discovering that we do have a fundamental low-level biological way of distinguishing water from other things. I read a book not terribly long ago on the disease rabies, and one of the consequences of rabies across all mammals is that it induces what's called hydrophobia, the fear of water. And that just seems almost unthinkable that a disease across mammal species could give this very specific behavior unless there was some consistent pathway that it was affecting that was itself involved in identifying water to begin with. So that's my 2 cents.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Dave Leff from the USA says, I stumbled across this podcast while recently looking for a cure for my insomnia. Episode 175 covered exactly what I was looking for and gave me a few jumping off points to get started on my path to recovery. And Smart Drug Smarts is now my go-to podcast for the latest info on top trending subjects. Listener Dr. Dingo from Australia says, more than just a podcast, a university course. My fishing mate is always asking me, where in the hell do you learn all of this? And I tell him, but I'm not sure that he listens yet though. So a big thanks to both of you. And thanks to everybody that's been spreading the word on Smart Drug Smarts. I have been hanging out with a lot of you all week. We've been doing the water fast week for the past 5 days. Some of us even earlier. I'm actually just about to finish mine. I had to start mine a couple days early. But yeah, as I record this, I have not had any food in 162 hours. And at this point, I'm watching the clock, just counting down the minutes until I can have dinner tonight. But it's been really great. You always learn something new. It was different for me this time than it has been the 2 previous years. For those of you who are already subscribed to the Brain Breakfast newsletter, the latest one published just this morning talks about the water fast, both some of the reasons behind it and exactly what it's like. And if you're not signed up for the Brain Breakfast yet, when you sign up, it gives you a link to the most recent episode, so you could go back if you're curious, check that out. Of course, we talk about plenty of other stuff there too, neuroscience related, almost all of it. You can sign up for the Brain Breakfast at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. While I'm on the subject of water fasting, a shout out to Kevin Rose, who earlier this year, or perhaps it was the very tail end of last year, introduced a fasting-based app called Zero to track things ranging from biomarkers to mood as a person goes through a water fast. A lot of folks participating in our fast this week have been using that app, and there's been good buzz around that. So if you're an appy person and looking to do a solo fast, check out Zero. One of the questions that I got on the chat forum this week was, will you continue taking Nexus and Mitogen during the fast? The answer, as I've talked about, is no, I did not. I did no supplementation with anything other than electrolytes during this fast. Just the basic sodium, potassium, magnesium. Also, each of those mineral electrolytes are totally acaloric, which is kind of the goal for a fast. And so this participant, she put it to me, well, are there actually calories in Nexus and Mitogen? And I didn't know the answer. I mean, I assume the answer is greater than 0, just based on the capsule itself, but it's something I had never really thought about. Looked into it a little bit, and I can say with some authority now that the average amount of Nexus and Mitogen I take in a day is at least 12 to 15 calories just from the capsules themselves. Might be a bit more than that when you consider the ingredients on the inside. Obviously nothing that's going to make up a major part of your diet if you're eating, but if you're fasting, probably a great time to do a washout. I will be getting back on the horse with Nexus and Mitogen during the coming week. Both of those, of course, can be found over at axonlabs.io on the web, and both of those you can probably remember their cognitive resumes from past episodes. Happy to get each of them back in my brain. Also in the supplement space, I mentioned it last week, I will mention it again. There is a really good opportunity to get on what's called the Vitamonk launch list. Get yourself early access at obscenely low prices to new products as they are launched onto the market by Vitamonk later this year and even into next year. Vitamonk has a great product line already and is going to be expanding that product line further. They're going to be going to 50, 75 items in their lineup. I don't know where they're planning on stopping or even if, but Vitamonk is a new partnership with Smart Drug Smarts, and they are really working hard to put together a great organization with really strong sourcing practices, quality control, customer service, you name it. So you can check them out at Vitamonk.com, but go to smartdrugsmarts.com/launch if you want really the single best thing they have to offer right now, which is the ability to get early access to new products on that launch list. That's all for now. I'm going to grab myself another sip of water, and we'll move on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. John Sullivan. He is a clinical sports psychologist and also the applied sports scientist for Providence College, the University of Rhode Island, and various professionals within the NFL, NBA, Olympics, etc., etc. He is a former Division I NCAA athlete himself and someone who has built a career out of fine-tuning the interplay between the brain and physical performance. And as you'll hear in the coming interview, he really draws a very thin or perhaps a very fuzzy and porous line between cognitive performance and what ultimately happens in the physical world. He's also author of the fairly recent book, The Brain Always Wins, which touches and expands on a lot of the same topics that we'll be covering within this interview. This one runs a bit longer than some of our recent interviews, but we cover a wide range of topics, everything from vomiting as a defense mechanism to where the trade-offs are between physical health and physical performance. Those two don't always march in lockstep. Listen for the point in the coming conversation where he talks about how endurance athletes, sometimes at a certain point in their sport, you'll see them start looking down, kind of looking at the ground straight in front of their feet, how that simple behavior might actually correspond to trying to bring in less visual information because their brain is tired, their mental processing system is tired, something which I think really squares up well with a lot of our intuitions, but I'd never thought about it quite like that before. Anyway, really interesting interview coming up with Dr. John Sullivan. Let's jump in now.
I think it really is a process and a journey for everyone to kind of where they end up. And for me, I was a Division I NCAA athlete. And even when I go back to earliest part of even competing as high school and then entering into college, I always had this question of like, there has to be more than VO2 max. There has to be more than cardiac efficiency. There has to be more to the process. And I kept coming across this area of brain performance interface, if you will. And I was lucky enough to have a mentor in undergrad who is a clinical psychologist, but also a sports psychologist. And you have to be a licensed psychologist to be a sports psychologist. And I think mentors make a big difference in all of our lives. I always encourage my interns, you want to connect with people that are going to connect you in your passion so it becomes a destiny. And he was smart enough to really show me sports psychology, but show me the vast variety of what psychology can bring. So it really started there with just the simple why. The whys matter, and they matter more now with such influence and avalanche of information coming at us.
What do you think are some of the commonalities and differences between sports performers and how they use their brains versus, I'm a software developer, so it's like I definitely need performance, but it's not necessarily my motor neurons that are firing all the time. What are some of the differences? What are some of the parallels?
You've described it really, really well there, that to the heart of it, performance is performance. There are very, very similar pathways to you as a computer programmer and a wide receiver in the NFL. And some of the similarities are we feel first, then think. Emotions run the show in sport and life. And often what we learn in our culture is thoughts drive emotions. That's actually not how the brain is wired. So your given practice of doing coding or creating a process, if you get frustrated or you're lethargic or you're having trouble with the attentional process, it's going to affect your output. The same for a wide receiver in the NFL. And so from that standpoint, ideally, brain, is very synchronized in the areas of performance. You brought up the differences. When you're a creative in your way in coding or you're an academic, we are not using our somatosensory cortex, our motor neurons as much. We're not running around the room or running around a computer as we're creating. Essentially, performance is performance. We go into the everyday life of being parents. That's a performance. It requires calmness. It requires that composure so then you can pattern recognize, what do I do next? How do I engage?
As a long-distance athlete, that seems to me like it might be making very different demands of our brains versus something like basketball where you're sprinting up a court, but then you have a pause period. What are some of the differences there when you're coaching athletes in one sports modality versus another?
That's a great question. In that sense of what are the differences between the energy demands on the brain and how does the brain react in those environments? Some of the major differences when we use the examples you gave, like a basketball, high dynamics, a lot of movement, a lot of moving parts you have to pay attention to. Same with soccer, same with lacrosse. At moments in football as well, even though that's more stop and go, not a flow sport. The bigger demands actually brain-based are pattern recognition. Can I understand what's happening in front of me? And then from that attentional process, make the right decision. And we often overlook that. That's where you see mental errors in sport, is when the brain gets overwhelmed with information. So now you have an emotional response that's fight or flight. And then what we typically see is individuals get aggressive then. But that can be falling and faltering to the pattern that's in front of them. A defense wants them to move a certain way. They get overwhelmed and then they get sucked into that process. So it's actually pattern recognition and emotion regulation are really key factors in flow sports that are often overlooked. Because once the brain gets fatigued, then you move differently, different power dynamics, different endurance dynamics, different speed dynamics, and then strength dynamics. So it's all brain first. So when you can handle more information coming in, you can handle what you do next. Where with endurance, it's more longer term fatigue. You still have to take in information. You can sometimes see this in big major track events. As you watch the athletes go through the laps of the event, many of the athletes who start looking down, they're not able to handle the information coming in. So there's a fatigue status between the brain and then the other 11 systems. So right there's a breakdown. So when you can increase not just VO2 max, but endurance athletes' information processing during a race, you're increasing their efficiency to task. Even when we go to high performance states and jobs, so air traffic controllers, pilots, surgeons, fatigue is a central nervous system gut-brain interaction. So all our neurotransmitters are made in our stomach. Our brain stores very few of them. And most of our neurotransmitters, not all, we can't make internally. It's by food ingestion, and it's a precursor to making that. So really looking and dialing in at how is the gut and brain communicating in these fatigue states. But fatigue we're understanding more and more, but it's cognitive related more than it is any other system in the body.
Fight or flight and flow states, I wanted to ask, those have both been mentioned, and what's the overlap between those two? I mean, they have in common that, you're not thinking self-consciously when you're in fight or flight or in flow, but anything else worth talking about there?
I think you described it really nicely. There is overlap in the sense that the brain is wired to survive, and so there has to be overlap and redundancy in systems, and there is. When we look at flow state, it's not that fight or flight competes against it unless the individual is overwhelmed. It can be a signal to return back to a flow state, and it can be a signal to regulate while you're just coming out of one. But typically, fight or flight interferes with trying to enter into one, because fight or flight is about mobilization of energy, it is about movement, it's about escape, and then eventually shutdown. That's where that autonomic nervous system goes into vomiting. Vomiting, we don't learn, is a defense mechanism, but it is. It's the final one. It's shutdown. And so if we manage emotions, then we manage the ability for the brain to become efficient with the task, especially if it's been mastered or understood at a very high level. So emotions we feel first, then we think, goes to the prefrontal cortex, then it moves to the higher order learning on the area of the brain that we kind of think of, where the wrinkly part. So it's not an on and off switch, fight or flight. You're absolutely right. It could be a signal for the performer to get regulated, to get right back into flow.
What are some strategies that people can use to sustain a high state of mental arousal for, as long as it's reasonable for what they're trying to do? Obviously, you need to allow some recharge and recovery in there, but maintaining vigilance to get done what they need to get done.
There is not one thing I can tell you that's going to immediately do that. That could be situational, but overall it's a process. And where we start is enhancing the functional system's rest and recovery, which is sleep. It's your number one performance enhancer. We've known quite a bit about it for a long time. There are still things we don't know. We don't know how to answer the question why we do. Not 100%. So some people are amazed by that, but that's just the truth. We don't 100% know why. We have some evolutionary clues. We have some modern clues about the neuroscience of it. Well, we don't know that. But what we do know is the brain detoxifies. It cleans itself. That has to happen first before any other system does. So if we don't start from that standpoint of increasing our readiness through sleep, your sustained attention and concentration is going to be greatly reduced. Your alertness just drops. Your listeners may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He was a theorist in psychology, and most people learn that. He was talking about more from a humanistic standpoint. But when you look at that from a neuroscience standpoint or neuropsychology standpoint of what we know now, he talked about basic needs being the foundation. Everything capitalizes off of that. He was talking about neuroscience. Sleep, hydration, food. If those are not established, you cannot really build on a strong foundation of readiness and alertness and high-level focus on demand. You can't. We can go longer without food and water and can without sleep. Food makes the neurotransmitters that communicate to the brain and the rest of the body, the peripheral nervous system. And hydration allows for a viscosity of blood for oxygen, glucose, and other vitamins and minerals to get to the brain. You reduce those, I'll find you someone that can't perform very well.
What are some of your recommendations for diet? We've had several episodes on diet, everything from ketogenic diets to vegetarianism in the past. Do you have any particular strong dietary recommendations for cognitive performance?
I think the science is also moving very fast on this. We've learned in the last probably 8 years, the gut biome is changing so many facets of medicine, performance, academic or educational spheres. Medical textbooks and nutritional textbooks all have to be rewritten now just because of the last 5 years of research. Where I go is back to the science where we're not doing this properly. We're not assessing people properly. We're looking at recommendations from a subjective standpoint, food logs, or just guesswork. But when I work with elite level practitioners in pro sport, in the elite military, and then when I'm working people in private practice or even within my concussion practice, I'm looking at, let's get bloods, let's get fecal matter. Got to look in, process the blood, you got to look coming out because it tells us what's in the gut and what's being processed. From that standpoint, we can really direct nutrition from a much better neurological and health standpoint than just saying, let's try this diet, which can work. And there are many, like you mentioned, there are many different diets out there. But when we prescribe them down to human variation, we get much better impact. And those tests are so much easier now and so much more accurate. So I would say you really want to do some assessment there because you can target better. And it's efficiency. You're getting efficient to what's going to benefit the person, their health, and their performance.
How are you on heart rate variability and all the various gadgets that are coming online in the consumer sphere now to measure moment by moment how your body's doing? It's pretty neat that we're now able to relatively easily track a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is I really love that too. The ecological ability to get moment-to-moment assessment, and that's where most of the science needs to be going. Whether we talk about nutrition, whether we talk about human welfare, whether we talk about human performance. HRV is a powerful, powerful measure that's only really taken root probably in the last 6 to 8 years in the United States. But the Russians were using it while they were establishing their preparedness for the space race. How do you put a cosmonaut on a rocket and know that they're functionally ready to do the task, absorb G-forces, cognitively be prepared to do all the systems preparation, and they couldn't do regular exercise physiology measures. Can't put them on a treadmill and then while sitting on top of the rocket. So they devised this, and then they have population parameters that are enormous, but they don't publish their literature in English. You have to translate it. Lucky enough to have colleagues that translated it. But we're catching up on that. That is a tremendous measure. And it really has gotten to like HRV for training on the phone, where they've really done their signal validation and their frequency validation, that what information they get off the phone has a particular error variance or error that we know it's accurate. We know it's valid. We can use it. So that accessible information to your listeners, or if we look at other ways of getting it through polar heart rate monitors, things of that nature, very, very, very helpful. Absolutely. Because that can tell you, referencing back to diet, back to sleep, back to readiness.
Is the stuff that's available to a U.S. consumer now ready? Is it worth buying, or is it still sort of a toy technology?
It's a wonderful question. I've written a number of journal articles about this with colleagues, and in my work, even in Australia with the Queensland Academy of Sport, we've got a living document that looks at this. What's out there? What's noise? What's junk? Who is taking the long slog haul of developing a consumer tool that's actually clinical grade? And there is a lot of noise out there, sadly. There are some that are more valid. And I think what I would say to consumers is to look, have they done their research on the signals are accurate? Have people done independent research on it? But the three things you need really is it proven safe.
Yeah.
If it isn't proven safe and they can't show that, not worth buying. And to give you an example, like some of the transcranial direct stimulation stuff like Think, and I'll just name it, they have no validation on it's safe. And they're working on this thing of, we were talking about before, this avalanche of information, marketing trying to supplant science. And I feel bad for consumers because I think as scientists we can get caught in it too. But if you're not literate on the process of technology development, you can fall for it every time because it looks good. It falls into a gray area where the FDA does not regulate this stuff. And the companies that do regulate it, they show it's safe. They show it's accurate, and then you'll see independent research that shows its usability, how it's action-oriented and you can use the information credibly. And there are companies out there that have done that. Many that don't.
What do you see when you're working with top-level athletes and performers, their own subjective self-assessments of how they think they're doing versus what actually comes out in the data? I always just wonder about our gut instincts, how credible they really are.
There's two ways to look at this. It depends upon their expertise and their understanding of reading their own biofeedback. If you're a novice in understanding your central nervous signals, there will be some error in the difference between measuring their experience, their emotions, just overall narrative of it, compared to an objective measure. However, if you train an athlete through biofeedback, which biofeedback is just understanding outward signals from the peripheral nervous system, how muscles feel, timing, anticipation, and then internal central, like how does my gut feel? How do I notice my heart rate? And then how do I think or process information during the experience? You can train someone to be more aware of that. And then it gets closer to the objective information. And that's what you want to be doing. What you're doing is teaching the athlete, independent of the technology, that they can be in the right moment with the right energy management, with the right interpretation of signals. Information outside them, information inside them. And so that's why you use technology to increase that education. So it's really just a novice effect on biofeedback. What do the signals mean?
It would be interesting to develop a training regimen for non-athletes to become more aware of the physicality of their different states, what's going on physically that can tip them off to how their body and brain is likely to behave.
I think there is some avenues in there. And actually, I would name a few companies because they've done their scientific journey and they're good products. So if you look at Spire, so Spire is breath related. It's a little device you wear on your belt. You calibrate it to your breath rate. And so we know breathing rate regulated through the vagus nerve, the longest nerve in our body connects the brain, the heart, and the stomach. As our breath rate changes, heart rate changes, and that signals changes in mood state, but also brainwave state. So it'll give you a signal noticing you when you're getting into tense breathing. So you get a biofeedback buzz, just a little buzz, no one's going to hear it, you'll feel it, to shift up your breathing to be more core related, diaphragmatic, where you're getting much more oxygen, extension of the lower lungs, so your brain calms down on the exhale. It is a really good training device. I've used it with snipers in their sense of away from the facility practice, when they're with their family, when they're in their normal life, when you can get much more control of that breath rate and drop your heart rate very, very fast. You have better control in stressful environments, and you're also conserving energy. And I also use it with coaches. Coaches on the sidelines lose their capacities through anger and frustration, are less likely to make good decisions, communicate to their athletes properly, and make effective changes in games. And we know coaches can change the face of a game. Mm-hmm. So there are devices out there. The other one I would mention would be Muse, which is a head-worn EEG device. And we write about both of those devices in the book, The Brain Always Wins, because Muse has done their validation. We know meditation. My co-author, Chris Parker, talks about meditation as wisdom of the village. It is thousands of years old, but with 21st century science, we're showing that it not only changes functional parts of the brain, but structural parts of the brain. But what's been so difficult for people to learn is that we have no feedback, biofeedback loops, neurofeedback loops. We're doing it right. Then when you gamify it, which Muse has done through an app, you have this potential of, again, increasing the tension of practice, meaning difficulty, and then getting better with it faster. These are two devices that connect that biofeedback of knowing mood states, concentration states, but then having control. And think about it, I'm teaching snipers to do this, quarterbacks to do this, surgeons, pilots, people that need to have these abilities on demand.
Snipers seem like a really interesting case study because I assume that they're getting the full military training to be physical athletes, but then essentially the job is to sit very still, focus on something, and wait for the perfect moment to strike, which seems almost more like, what a chess player would do. What are some of the specifics of training somebody with that as their role?
Yeah, and I want to give a broad view of this too, because law enforcement goes through, they also with their SWAT teams have snipers too. So the roles are quite similar. You're protecting people or you're acquiring targets to protect people. And really that is their role. Like you said, like a chess player, be able to process information very, very quickly, then make accurate decisions while doing high level of math in understanding wind dynamics, aerodynamics, the weapon system they're using, the actual type of bullet. All this stuff has to be calculated very, very quickly. So they're trained at a very, very high level from an emotional standpoint. Is I stay calm, then I can process information, even in between shots. And that's critical because once you shoot, you've exposed your location. So you immediately have to stay calm to acquire more targets or defend against the worst thing they have to defend against, another sniper in the field finding their location. And so the traditional military training on this is they learn the weapon system and then they learn they're the weapon system. And it's brain first performance, because we all are, and calmness leads to that ability of multiple object tracking. I can track 9 things at once and then figure out what's the most important process there of where I address my decision. Is decision making actually at its heart, and does it transfer to other professions? Absolutely.
That is really interesting. You point out that the sniper's first job is target selection, more than just focusing on a target. Because I was kind of thinking, okay, well, it's like, you watch where the little X is in your gun and that's kind of the job. But you're right. You have to be watching the scenario, figuring out what's worth paying attention to. And the target selection is probably the biggest mental hurdle.
It is, absolutely. And they do a lot of observation, similar to other jobs that people do. You have to take in the field view and then process that. But again, if you think about their environment, they're in a threatening environment. Calmness has to be maintained. And I'll go even before that. Attention is a process. We often think it's an event. It's actually a tripart process. And it really fits when I bring it to a sniper environment, but it fits for your environment. It fits for someone on the stock exchange. It fits for a surgeon. It's actually a tripart process that is, first, we have to be alerted. So you were talking about that big picture they have to take. Alerted to something. Then they have to be able to track it. Then they can get to decision making. And if you're not calm, every one of the sequences gets more difficult. In fact, you typically can't get past the first one, which is I can't find what is most important.
That is always the bazillion-dollar question is, what makes it onto tomorrow's to-do list? Which of these emails in my in-basket is worth paying attention to now? If you can just select the job that's worth doing, I mean, that's 80% of the job a lot of the time.
Yeah. Even when we look at research on the stock exchange, when they're able to stay calmer, they're able to prioritize those targets much better. And what we forget about is we grow up with a myth in our environment that being quote unquote psyched up, being aroused, have high energy is the right amount of energy for excellence or completing of an outcome. And it's not actually. It's a level of calmness. Now there may be individual variation about how they experience calmness. It could be a little higher, a little lower, but it's really a composure and calmness. It's not being psyched up.
I think our default thinking is always that people that are in good health are good physical performers. But I mean, oftentimes physical health and performance can almost be natural enemies of one another. If you are like, you're dealing with people in the NFL, obviously top performers, but I mean, that can be just tremendous wear and tear on the body. If you want to have a healthy brain at 90, you do not want to be an NFL player in your prime. How do you think people best balance the competing demands of health and performance? Or is there a balance to be had? Do you need to pick a favorite?
I think westernized view of sport is subtly changing, but continues to need to. And I think you described the two buckets that we almost pretend that health and performance don't touch. Because we can think of examples like you gave. We can think of even like Michael Jordan. He had a fever like 103 and performed in a playoff game. But we have to understand that health is the foundation for performance. There is no separation. And your example with the NFL is accurate. We have to keep them healthy. And not everyone ends up with CTE. But if we don't protect everyone like that's the possibility, we are not protecting talent. We are certainly not developing it. And I think sport, as well as business, we have to come to an understanding that if your employees aren't healthy, good luck on output. We have fallen victim to the false concepts through belief bias and illusion of validity that mental toughness and grit have any value. They don't. Scientifically, they're very poor. Angela Duckworth's work has been shown to be invalid. Mental toughness was a term that was rebranded in the 1980s, and it has had very little scientific footing until about 2005, and it's still poor. Think about it. They don't fit. And that's the battle of that health and performance, is we live with the Hollywood ethos, that mental toughness and grit. So someone's not gritty enough or tough enough. When what we're dealing with from the get-go is the brain is the most sophisticated survival system in the known universe. So we're born tough from the get-go. It's how we train cycles of stimulation or stress and cycles of recovery. We got to dose it properly on both ends. And what we do in business and life and sport is we do linear stress. Work, 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 work. And the rest does not match it. So what do we not get? Neuroplasticity, neurogrowth, adaptation through other systems in the body, neuromuscular, cardiac, endocrine. Really what you're talking about is when we look at health and performance, it's about dosing properly, training, whatever that might be, and then recovery to meet the demands of growth, adaptation, evolution. And what we've done is linear stress. And we just use the admin, you're not tough enough, you're not gritty enough.
Biologically, our daily circadian rhythms, those are the most fundamental. We live on a planet going around the sun that happens once every 24 hours, so there's going to be a cycle there anyway. Does it make sense for us to align our mental rest and recovery to those circadian rhythms and just think about all that on a daily schedule, or are there other equally valid cycles?
I think you're absolutely right. When we look at chronobiology, all the systems, light coming through our eye, turns on the brain, turns on all the other systems, all the other cellular systems kind of engage. Absolutely, chronobiology is one of those things we do have to pay attention to. It's not the only one, but I think it is very, very valuable. And I'll give you some examples to the heart of culture and sport in general. So if you look at many, many school systems, they often have school starting at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. And when we look at the chronobiology and the sleep rhythms and the brain abilities, and then also availability for learning, you start school that early with those age ranges, quite frankly, there's an effect on absenteeism, turnover, sickness. And I'm also talking about students and teachers. And then GPA of students is reduced. Then we go to sport. If they're playing a sport after school, we see an increase in injury rate. And so absolutely is something we should be paying attention to. When we go to pro sport, often we look at the times when they train. There are windows of trainability, plasticity basically on the brain, where it matches with endocrinology, testosterone or estrogen. And those windows throughout the day, those are the times when we should be training. Yet a lot of teams will train at 6 a.m. or they train late into the evening. Those are not ideal times for retention of learning or protection of talent. And so to your point, those rhythms we should be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
But then we should be diving a little bit deeper. One of the things we're not doing in business, academics, and athletics is looking at how neuroscience is guiding where are the opportunities for excellence, health, and performance based and balanced. When we know there's neurodiversity, research from 1896 looking at diversity in reading abilities, and we still train everyone in our educational process as one size fits all. That's ridiculous. There's neurodiversity. We talk about human variation, but we ignore Darwin's research. And now with the neuroscience, we know it's true.
Yeah, I think we've got an antiquated education system from the assembly line era. We've known that's not ideal for a while, but that's how it's been done for a long, long time.
As opposed to what we know is true, that we don't train groups of people or teams. We train or educate individuals. And when you bring it down to that, it's a more efficient and it's also more effective. That's one of the things I think is sport is starting to alert to, but where it's always been alerted, and I think they're ahead of the game because it's not budgetary, it's because of need. The elite military is probably the leader in performance and concussion because they understand that they're training a very unique group of individuals. And if they do a one-size-fits-all, they're not going to protect talent and they're not going to develop it. They're also not in the business of sharing. So that science may not see the light of day for decades. However, we can learn from it. And so when you go to biological rhythms, that goes to individuality. That goes meeting the brain where it's at. In the book, we talk about process and how do we come to that. We use that terminology, and we really came from a scientific, empirical standpoint. Also, our training program is individualized. It's based upon human variation because we are not gurus. We're standing on the shoulders of others. And what the research says is you have to put a process together that's individualized. Otherwise, you have faulted from moment one. It's just true. Stage models don't work. Factory models don't work in education, to your point, which was fantastic. It's so true. That's where it came from.
What are some of the dietary recommendations that you have for people to make sure that they're getting enough biological precursors for the various neurotransmitters that they're going to need? Just making sure that the stockpiles never run empty.
Yeah, I think one of the things is looking at tryptophan. And so one of the neurotransmitters we know the most about, we know quite a bit about other neurotransmitters, but there's been a focus on serotonin. And so serotonin has to do with mood, has to do with focus. It also has connections into motor control. And we don't make it internally. So tryptophan, things like banana, turkey, they're high in tryptophan. And so once you get that in through nutrition, you're making available the process for serotonin to be made and then reach your brain. So it's effectively a real important part of resiliency. And then when we look at athletes, now exercise increases serotonin. Sport does not. Exercise and sport are very different things. Sport is really trauma. You think about the intensity of training, all the things that go into it, travel, their sport affects their life affects their sport. It's a big, sticky mess. Exercise should be dosed properly, not always, but when it's dosed properly, it's really neuroprotective, and especially when we use examples of collision sports. So in sport, what we see is it increases serotonin at the time of exercise, but because it's it's so intense, it ends up being really not absorbed. And so we have to really kind of make sure they get those precursors in. And so to maintain mood health, motor control, memory, and alertness. So tryptophan cannot be overemphasized enough, because most of our culture, though, is we're eating much more processed foods, which don't have precursors. And when we lose serotonin, it opens the door to depression, anxiety. Again, everything's neuroderivative. Everything's a neurochemical reaction. So I tend to focus there because we see some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression in this culture in the United States.
For people wanting to calm down at the end of the day, especially like the high performer driven people, they're trying to calm down, they're trying to get to sleep. What are some of the recommendations that you have lifestyle wise there?
Sometimes scheduling a meditative practice before bed enhances that piece that we all learned as we were kids. Our parents had this routine. That routine was slowing down. Well, a meditative practice, a great thing to benchmark right up against going to sleep, because you're slowing down the brain so everything else follows. And you're giving an opportunity for neurotransmitters to increase and hormones to increase, like melatonin. It surges. You can train it to surge more. The other thing is using cryotherapy. So often as kids, we used to take showers, warm showers before bed. That was easier than trying to get kids showering in the morning. A lot of parents have done that or do that. We know that if you change temperature, our core temperature, just a bit, up or down, in this instance it'd be up, we get sedated, we get calm. Just like any of us who've been in a hot car.
Yeah.
Or if you're driving, you get drowsy. So just using how our brain works with our other systems can help slow down. Now we have to look at removing things. We know all of us have grown up in an environment. Some of us have grown up in it. Some of us have had to adapt to it. Technology. Technology is just a tool, but it creates a lot of interference in our neural patterns. The light emitting from our TVs, from our tablets, from our laptops and our phones is giving off a frequency of blue light. Blue light wakes up the brain. And in fact, they designed the blue light on these devices to equivalent to 12 noon. So if you think about 12 noon, that's peak chronobiology. We're awake, we're alert, we're ready. And so we have to reduce that light at least 30 to 40 minutes before bed. And many people sit in bed and watch movies on their tablets or play games, and that is making your melatonin, which creates that drowsiness effect, surge down. And so that's a major concern. So we want to remove those devices.
It's just always interesting to me, performance versus long-term brain health and longevity, sort of two poles. I mean, you could probably take a bunch of Adderall and you're going to be able to focus for longer than you would otherwise be able to, but that's not a sustainable thing. The 90-year-old version of your brain won't be thanking you for that.
No, and it has effect on and we know this. We know from Adderall, the research on that, whether if you're diagnosed properly and obviously giving that as a tool, we know, like to your point, long-term effect. It affects the gut-brain axis. It affects the endocrine system. And so we have to give vacations. So to your point, even with some of the stuff we know, it's about timing and dosing, even if it's effective. And that's often missed. And that goes down to the individual. We have to be assessing that on an individual basis. But to your point, yes, absolutely, some stuff isn't sustainable. You got to take breaks.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. John Sullivan for taking the time for that conversation. Once again, Dr. Sullivan is the author of The Brain Always Wins, and he can be found online at performancedocs.com. I really enjoyed his talk about the difference between exercise and sports and how each of those might have effects on the different level of neurotransmitters that you have on tap afterwards. Dose your exercise with care. He mentioned food sources, banana and turkey, as being especial standouts for getting tryptophan and then the downstream serotonin, and took some swings at the psychological crowd that gets behind mental toughness and grit as real measurable attributes. I kind of love it when the interview guests go out on a limb and say something controversial. Last week, Dr. Biederman didn't have anything particularly nice to say about meditation, which is good. It shows that neuroscience is still a lively science, an active playing field with a lot going on and huge amounts still to be learned. That comes as a surprise to no one. What might come as a surprise to some, however, is a public statement by a guy speaking on behalf of two groups, each of which have very big microphones. I will tell you about that next in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So the war on drugs, both in the U.S. and abroad, has been going on since the 1960s and the Nixon administration, and has become sort of a standing part of the cultural landscape. It's almost hard to imagine what the world might look like without that. Towing the status quo, just last year, member states at the United Nations General Assembly special session on drugs were still maintaining that prohibition and criminalization of drugs are the way to go with anything that's a narcotic. So it came as something of a surprise when on this year's International Day Against Drug Abuse, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, called for tackling personal drug problems with prevention and treatment and by adhering to human rights throughout the process. In a joint press release with the World Health Organization, he described how the two bodies say that their member states should go about ending healthcare discrimination and specifically calling for reviewing and repealing punitive laws that have been proven to have negative health outcomes, which would include laws related to drug use or possession of drugs for personal use. Guterres, who was Prime Minister of Portugal at the time that country launched its highly controversial decriminalization program, which has since proved to be very successful, said, "Despite the risks and challenges inherent in tackling this global problem, I hope and believe that we are on the right path. I know from personal experience how an approach based on prevention and treatment can yield positive results." Detractors of what Guterres did in Portugal thought that it was going to be sort of a canary in a coal mine of what would happen in the case of drug decriminalization, turning it into a crime and junkie-infested country. It turns out that's not what happened at all. The country saw that drug-related fatalities fell to one of the lowest levels in all of Europe, and there was also a dramatic reduction in the incidence of drug-related health issues, most notably a drop in the spread of HIV among needle-using drug addicts. Portugal's approach was to allow for the possession and use of drugs in small quantities, which in some cases might still get you a monetary fine, but there would be no jail time and no criminal record associated with it. And this system also allowed users who needed help to ask for help, knowing that they wouldn't get into any trouble. Now, of course, calling for change and actually getting change are two very different things, as we all know, and there's massive entrenched industries on both sides of this, both the law enforcement and the illegal drug trade itself, that have a vested interest in making sure that things that are illegal stay illegal. So what happens next is anybody's ballgame, but when the World Health Organization and the UN publicly seem to be changing their tune on something, that's worth paying attention to.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, so that was it for this 189th episode of Smart Drug Smarts. If you're curious about the links to anything that we talked about here, you can find that up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/189. If you missed last week's episode, number 188, I spoke with Dr. Irving Biederman about the neural correlates of cognitive pleasure, or to put that a bit more colloquially, why we find new things interesting. And next week, to get back to our biochemical roots, we're going to be talking about a chemical called sulforaphane. It's making broccoli sprouts cool again, and we'll be talking with one of its main researchers and popularizers about why that is so. Reminder that if you're curious about the water fast that I am just about to finish up, if you sign up for the Brain Breakfast newsletter, you'll get a link to that most recent installment, so you can check that out, smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter to do that. And I will see you back here next Friday, as usual. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.